Snowflakes clung to the hem of her tattered skirt as she stumbled along the dirt road that cut across the empty land. Her boots were worn thin, hardly more than scraps holding together, and every step pressed a shiver deeper into her bones. The prairie wind carried no mercy, whipping against her face until her cheeks stung. Somewhere in the distance, she could see the outline of a ranch house, large, proud, and built to withstand winters that would break most souls. She pressed her hands tighter around the small cloth bundle she carried. It was all she had left, a scrap of bread and the last bit of stitching she had worked on by firelight. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but desperation was stronger. The land itself seemed to test her. Stretches of frozen fields and the ghostly shapes of cattle moving slow through the storm reminded her she was an outsider here. The rich ranchers had their herds, their barns, and their warm fires. She had nothing, yet something stronger than shame pulled her toward that house. She wasn't just begging for food or shelter. She was begging for a chance to live again. By the time she reached the porch, her hands were so numb she could barely lift them to knock. The heavy wooden door looked more like a wall between two worlds, the one she had been cast into, ragged and forgotten, and the one where people still believed in tomorrow. She struck her fist once against the door, the sound hollow against the storm's howl. For a moment she thought no one would come. Then a light flickered behind the window, and footsteps approached. The man who opened the door stood tall, his frame broad from years of work under sun and snow. His shirt was plain, but the leather vest and clean boots spoke of a life secured by cattle and land. His eyes studied her, not cruel but cautious, the way a man measures a stranger before letting them into his world. Behind him, the faint sound of laughter drifted through the hall, young voices chasing one another through the house. It struck her like a knife, children who had warmth, children who had someone to care for them. She lowered her head quickly, her voice catching in her throat as she whispered, "Please, I'll work for anything. Just let me earn a place by the fire." The rancher's brow furrowed. He was not a man who took charity lightly, nor one who opened his door to strangers. Yet there was something in the way she stood, trembling but unbroken, that caught at him. He didn't move aside yet, only asked, "Work, you say? What kind of work do you think you can manage in your state?" Her fingers clutched at the bundle in her arms. "I can sew, I can mend clothes, patch leather, I'll scrub floors, carry water. I'm stronger than I look. Just don't turn me away." Her words trembled, but her eyes held steady. Before he could answer, a small figure peeked out from behind him. A girl with braided hair and wide eyes, perhaps 8 years old, looked at the stranger with curiosity. "Papa, who is she?" she asked, her voice full of innocence. Another child appeared then, older by a few years, tugging the younger one back gently. "Don't bother him. Come away," the older girl whispered, but her gaze lingered on the woman in rags. There was something in their eyes, something searching, as though they too felt the absence of someone who should have been there. The rancher's jaw tightened. His wife had passed seasons ago, leaving him with 2 daughters and a household that had never felt whole since. He managed the cattle and the land with an iron will, but raising 2 girls in the roughness of the frontier was a task he could not master alone. More than once he had thought of sending for help, but pride and grief had kept him silent. Now, as he looked at the woman before him, shivering and desperate, an unexpected thought crossed his mind. "You're not just asking for work, are you?" His voice dropped, low and careful. She looked up startled, unsure how to answer. He studied her again, his eyes softer now, yet edged with something weighty. "You came to this house with more than an empty stomach, didn't you?" The woman swallowed hard, caught between fear and hope. Her heart beat so loudly she thought he must hear it. "I came because I have nowhere else. I came because I don't want to die in the cold. But I swear, I'll give everything I have if you'll only let me stay." The storm rattled the shutters, and for a long moment he said nothing. His daughters lingered in the hall, watching their father with wide, silent eyes. Finally, he stepped aside just enough to let the glow of the hearth reach her frozen face. "Come inside before the cold finishes what it started," he said. "But understand this work here is not easy, and trust does not come quick." She crossed the threshold, warmth wrapping around her like a forgotten dream. The smell of stew drifted from the kitchen, nearly undoing her with hunger, but she held herself steady. The girls whispered to each other, their voices hushed but filled with curiosity. The rancher closed the door firmly behind her, shutting out the storm. For the first time in months, she felt the ground beneath her was solid again. Yet before she could thank him, his words stopped her cold. "I've been searching for more than a hand to clean or a cook to stir the pot," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "My girls need someone who can guide them, care for them, teach them gentleness. I cannot. So, I'll ask you straight." His gaze locked with hers, unflinching. "Will you be the mother my girls need?" The words struck her like thunder. She hadn't expected this. Not so soon, not from a man who owed her nothing. Her breath caught, and her heart trembled with both terror and a strange, burning hope. What kind of life was he offering? Was it mercy, or a burden she could never bear? The girls' faces watched her, expectant and fragile, and the storm outside beat harder against the walls, as though the world itself waited for her answer. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She was caught between past wounds and the possibility of something she hadn't dared dream belonging. The fire crackled, the rancher stood steady, and two pairs of young eyes held on to her with the weight of a future not yet spoken. And in that breathless pause, the question hung heavy in the room, demanding an answer she wasn't ready to give. Would she step into this role, or walk back into the cold with nothing? The night waited, and so did they. The fire popped as a log split, sending sparks up the stone chimney, and she stood frozen in the rancher's living room, her hands clasped tight around her bundle. The question he had asked still lingered in the air, heavy and strange, as though it belonged to another world. She hadn't expected mercy, let alone such a request. Her throat tightened as she tried to form words, but all that came was silence. The rancher didn't push her, didn't repeat the question. He only studied her with the quiet patience of a man used to waiting out storms. The girls lingered near the table, whispering, their eyes darting between her and their father. The older one carried herself with a maturity that didn't match her years, standing slightly in front of the younger as if to shield her. The younger girl clutched a small rag doll against her chest, her braids loose from running about. And though she stared with curiosity, there was no fear in her gaze. That struck her most of all. Children usually looked away from rags and dirt, yet these two seemed to search for something familiar in her. Her fingers flexed against her bundle, and for a fleeting moment, she thought of her own past. The small cabin, where she had grown up, the laughter of siblings long gone, the hands of her mother guiding her as she learned to stitch scraps of cloth into something useful. That world had been swept away by loss and hardship, but the memory still pressed against her heart. The rancher's question wasn't just about work. It was about stepping into a place she wasn't sure she deserved. He finally turned toward the table, pulling out a chair. "Sit," he said simply. The word was more command than invitation, but there was no harshness in it. She hesitated, then lowered herself slowly, feeling the warmth from the fire ease into her bones. The smell of food clung to the air, and her stomach growled before she could hide it. The girls giggled softly, and the younger one whispered, "She's hungry, Papa." The rancher's eyes flicked to his daughter, then back to the woman. He ladled stew from the pot into a bowl, set it in front of her, and handed her a spoon. She muttered thanks, though the word felt too small for the mercy he'd shown. Every bite she took seemed to bring her strength back, though shame burned in her chest for needing it so badly. When the bowl was empty, she set it down carefully, as though afraid it might vanish. Her voice finally returned, low but steady. "You asked me something I don't know how to answer. I came here for work, not for that." The rancher leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His face was hard to read, weathered by years of sun and labor, but not cruel. "Work, I can find plenty of. But work is not the same as what these girls need. They've gone too long without a woman's hand in this house." His words were simple, but the weight behind them stirred something in her chest, a mix of fear and longing. The older girl finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "We don't remember Mama much. Try to keep her things safe for us, but it isn't the same." She glanced at her father, then at the woman in rags. "Papa doesn't ask people for help, not ever. If he asked you, it must mean something." Silence filled the room again, broken only by the wind outside. She wanted to speak, to ask why fate had brought her to this doorstep, but the words wouldn't come. The rancher didn't press her, only rose and motioned to the girls. "Time for bed," he said firmly. The younger pouted but obeyed, dragging her doll up the stairs, while the older guided her with quiet patience. When their footsteps faded, he looked back at the woman. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk about work. And about the rest, when you're ready." His voice was steady, yet something in his eyes told her he was a man holding on to more than he let show. He left her by the fire with a blanket, and she curled beneath it, staring into the flames. Her mind spun with questions. Why had he chosen her, a stranger, to ask such a thing? Why did the girls look at her as though they already hoped she would stay? She had nothing, no dowry, no fine clothes, no family name to offer, only her hands and her will to survive. Could that ever be enough for what he asked? Through the night, she dozed and woke, the storm outside rattling the windows. She thought of the road she had traveled, the towns where no one had offered her more than scraps, the faces that turned away at the sight of her rags. This ranch was the first place she had been allowed to sit at a table in months. It frightened her, this small flicker of belonging. She feared what it might cost. At dawn, the ranch house stirred with the sound of chores. The girls' voices echoed faintly as they fed the chickens, and the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. She rose quickly, folding the blanket with care as though she owed it a debt. When the rancher entered, hat already on his head, he handed her a broom. "Start with the floors. We'll see what else you can manage." She worked without stopping, scrubbing and sweeping, her body aching, but her spirit steady. Every stroke of the broom, every cloth she wrung out felt like proof that she could earn her keep here. The girls peeked at her from doorways, whispering, then darting away. By midday, the older one brought her a cup of water. "You're fast," she said shyly. "Papa says fast workers are good workers." The younger giggled behind her, clutching her doll. The rancher watched from the doorway, silent. He saw how she bent to the work without complaint, how the girl's eyes followed her with a curiosity that had been missing since their mother passed. He didn't say a word, but his thoughts were troubled. He had opened his door to her because of desperation as much as instinct. But could a woman with nothing to her name carry the weight of being mother to his children? Or would he be setting them all up for disappointment? That night, after supper, he sat by the fire while the girls worked on small bits of sewing. The woman sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, eyes drawn to the flicker of the flames. Finally, the older girl looked up. "Papa, will she stay?" Her voice was careful, but the question was bold. He didn't answer at once. His gaze shifted to the woman, and she felt the weight of it settle on her. She didn't know how to answer the girl either. Her heart was torn between fear of failing and the strange pull she felt toward this house, this family she didn't know. The storm had passed, but a heavier storm brewed inside her. She could leave tomorrow, take the road again, keep her freedom and her loneliness, or she could stay, risk being bound to expectations she wasn't sure she could meet. No. The rancher's question still echoed in her mind, as sharp and alive as when he had spoken it. "Will you be the mother my girls need?" Her silence stretched, and in it lay the tension of a choice that would shape all their futures. The girls watched with wide eyes. The rancher waited with steady patience. And she felt the weight of the firelight press against her chest like the start of something too big to name. And though her lips parted as if to answer, the words refused to come. The night grew darker, the house quiet, and the question lingered still, unanswered. Waiting for her heart to decide, the days passed with a rhythm she had not felt in years, a rhythm set by the land and the needs of the ranch. Every morning before dawn, the rooster crowed, the cattle lowed in the distance, and the house stirred to life. She rose quickly, wrapping her shawl tight against the morning chill, and set about her tasks. The broom, the wash bucket, the needle and thread all became extensions of her hands. Yet each stroke of work carried with it the weight of an unspoken question. No. The rancher had not repeated it, but it lingered between them like a shadow that stretched across every corner of the house. The girls followed her everywhere, their eyes filled with a hope they were too young to hide. The younger one slipped her rag doll into the woman's lap while she mended shirts by the fire, whispering she needs fixing too. The older one lingered nearby, careful but watchful, testing the stranger's patience with small questions about sewing or cooking. The woman answered softly, each word measured, not wanting to open herself too quickly, yet unable to shut them out. Still, beneath the warmth of those small exchanges, she carried her own fears. She remembered the road behind her, the hunger, the empty nights when even hope had abandoned her. Could she really belong here, in this house, where the walls carried the laughter and silence of a family not her own. She told herself she was only working, only surviving another winter. But the rancher's eyes, steady and searching, unsettled, the thought each time they met hers. The rancher himself wrestled with his own unease. He saw the way his daughters brightened with the woman's presence, the way the house seemed less hollow with her voice moving through it. Yet he also knew that life on the land demanded strength beyond sentiment. A woman without kin, without resources, could be as fragile as a fence post in the wind. Was it fair to place his daughters' fragile hearts in her care? He kept his questions close, speaking little, but his silence was its own kind of pressure. Beyond the walls of the house, the land carried its own challenges. Winter was harsh, feed for the cattle was thinning, and wolves had been seen near the far ridge. The rancher spent long days mending fences, hauling hay, and riding out to check on the herds. Sometimes he returned late, his shoulders stiff with exhaustion, his face shadowed by worry he didn't voice. She saw it, though, and quietly placed a hot meal before him when he came in. He never thanked her outright, but his eyes softened as he ate, and she knew the gesture was not lost on him. One evening, while the rancher was still out, a neighbor rode up the long path. His horse's hooves echoed across the frozen ground, and his figure cut sharp against the fading sky. The woman opened the door cautiously, unsure whether to greet him. He tipped his hat, his gaze sweeping over her with curiosity. "You're new," he said simply. "I heard he took someone in." She nodded, clutching the edge of her shawl tighter. The man dismounted, dusting snow from his coat. "Name's Bennett. I run the land east of here. Folks are talking." A stranger showing up in rags and staying under his roof, that'll stir whispers. His voice wasn't unkind, but there was a sharpness to it that made her shift her weight uneasily. The girls peered from behind her, curious but quiet. Bennett's eyes flicked to them, then back to the woman. "You don't trust Easy, that one. If he let you in, there's a reason. Just be sure you don't give him cause to regret it." With that, swung back onto his horse and rode off, leaving her with a cold unease curling in her chest. That night, when the rancher returned, she said nothing of the visit, but the weight of Bennett's words gnawed at her. She had already seen the guarded looks in town when she ventured to the store for flour. Folks there measured her with their eyes, whispering under their breath. In this land, reputations mattered, and hers was no more than a threadbare shawl and a pair of worn boots. If she failed here, she would have nowhere left to go. The tension deepened as days turned to weeks. The girls grew more attached, the rancher more watchful, and the silence around the unspoken question stretched thinner. One evening, as she mended by the fire, the older girl spoke again. "You don't talk about where you came from," she said softly. The younger one looked up too, waiting for an answer. Her fingers paused on the needle. Memories flickered sharp in her mind, the cabin that had burned, the sickness that had taken her parents, the brother who had vanished west in search of gold, leaving her alone. Shame clung to those memories, the kind that came from losing everything and having nothing to show for it. She forced a small smile and said, "I came from a place that's gone now. All that matters is where I am." The older girl studied her as if weighing those words, then nodded slowly. The younger, satisfied enough, nestled against her side with the rag doll. Yet the woman knew the truth would not stay hidden forever. Secrets had a way of clawing out into the open, and she feared what would happen when hers did. Meanwhile, the rancher faced troubles of his own. A neighbor's herd had been raided by rustlers, and there was talk of strangers moving along the trails. Each ride out into the hills carried risk, and he knew he could not afford to let his guard down. He worried, too, about the vulnerability of his home. With a stranger under his roof and whispers spreading through town, he wondered if he had opened his door too quickly. One night, as the storm raged outside, he finally spoke. "I don't care what folks say about me," he said, his voice low but firm, "but I won't have my girls hurt. If you've got past troubles, that'll find their way here. Best to say it now." His eyes were sharp, cutting through the flicker of firelight. Her hands trembled against the fabric she was sewing. She wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare the pieces of her life that had driven her here. But the fear of being cast out, of seeing the girls' faces fall in disappointment, sealed her lips. "I've got nothing that would bring trouble to your door," she said carefully. "Only my hands and what little I know." He studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. The silence that followed was heavy, not of peace but of questions left unanswered. The conflict pressed deeper with each passing day. She worked, she sewed, she scrubbed, yet she could not escape the feeling of being tested, measured against something unseen. The rancher's daughters clung to her presence as though she were already part of their family, while their father weighed her with the caution of a man who had lost too much before. One evening the younger girl slipped into her lap, eyes wide with innocence. "Will you stay forever?" she asked, her small voice carrying more weight than she knew. Torn between the longing to say yes and the terror of promising something she might not be able to keep. She kissed the child's hair instead of answering, her silence louder than words. The rancher, standing in the doorway, watched quietly, his expression unreadable. He knew the question was not just his to ask anymore. It was the girl's too. And the longer it went unanswered, the more the tension stretched between them all, fragile as glass. Beyond the walls, the land grew harsher. Wolves prowled closer, the cattle grew restless, and whispers in town grew sharper. Within the house, warmth and unease mingled, a fragile balance that could not hold forever. And in the quiet moments, when she lay awake beneath the blanket, she wondered if the storm waiting for them was not the one outside in the hills, but the one inside these walls, born of hope, fear, and questions none of them were ready to answer. The winter deepened, and with it came a heaviness that pressed on everyone in the house. The ranch seemed to breathe under the weight of snow, each morning a fight to keep fences standing and cattle alive. She threw herself into work with a determination that surprised even her. Her hands, raw from scrubbing and stitching, told the story of someone clawing their way into a place they weren't sure they belonged. Yet every task she finished made the house warmer, more whole. Still, beneath it all, the rancher's question hung in the air, and the silence around it grew sharper with each passing day. The girls clung to her more than ever. The younger one now followed her from room to room, doll tucked beneath her arm, asking endless questions about how to cook, how to fold laundry, how to thread a needle. The older one studied her carefully, as if watching to see whether she would falter or prove herself worthy of the place she'd been given. The woman felt their hopes pressing against her heart, hopes she feared she could never live up to. Every time the younger one slipped her small hand into hers, every time the older one's eyes softened with trust, the weight of their need grew heavier. The rancher saw it too. He didn't voice his thoughts, but he noticed the way his daughter's laughter returned, the way the hollowness of the house filled again. And while part of him longed to believe it could last, another part remained hard as the frozen earth. He knew the world too well to trust easily, and in her silence about her past, in the way she sidestepped questions, he felt a threat he couldn't name. Tension began to show in small cracks. One evening at supper, the older girl asked if the woman might help her with her school lessons. The rancher frowned slightly and said, "Your studies are your own. Don't trouble her with more than she can handle." The girl lowered her eyes, but disappointment flickered across her face. The woman opened her mouth to say she didn't mind, but the words caught when she saw the rancher's gaze, firm, guarded, almost warning. It was a reminder that though she was inside his house, she was still an outsider, walking a thin line she dared not cross. But fate was not kind enough to let the conflict stay hidden within four walls. Trouble came from the land itself. One morning, the rancher rode out to check the far pastures and returned with a face set like stone. "It's per supper," he told them, "tracks out by the ridge. Rustlers, they've been near." His voice was calm, but the sharpness in his eyes told the rest. Rustlers meant danger. Men bold enough to steal cattle were bold enough to do worse. The girls fell silent, their spoons still in their bowls, and the woman felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. That night she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, sounded like footsteps. She rose quietly, wrapped her shawl, and moved to the window. The land stretched white and endless, but she couldn't shake the sense of eyes in the dark. When she finally returned to her blanket, the rancher's voice startled her. "You're awake." He stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He studied her for a long moment before saying, "This land don't forgive weakness. If those men come closer, it'll test us all." His gaze held hers, steady and unyielding. "If you mean to stay, you'll need to be stronger than you've ever been." Her throat tightened. But she managed to whisper, "I've survived worse." It was the closest she had come to confessing her past, and for a moment, Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe even respect. But he didn't press her. He only gave a slow nod, as though marking her words. The following days tightened the noose of suspense. The rancher rode farther, stayed out longer, returning with news of broken fences, missing cattle, and strangers seen on the trails. The girls grew nervous, watching the door each night until he returned. The woman kept the hearth burning and her hands busy, but inside, dread coiled like a snake. If the rancher fell, if harm came to him, what would become of the girls? What would become of her? The whispers in town did not help. On her next trip to fetch supplies, she heard Bennett again, speaking to another man near the store. He's got a stranger in his house, dressed in rags when she came. Folks don't know where she's from. Might be she's brought the trouble with her. The words burned hot in her ears. She kept her head down, clutching the sack of flour, but the sting of judgment followed her all the way back to the ranch. That night she almost told the rancher what she'd overheard. But when she saw him at the table, exhaustion written across his face, she bit the words back. He had enough burdens already. And yet her silence only fed the tension, the space between what was spoken and what was kept hidden. The storm broke one night when the sound of horses came from beyond the ridge. The rancher was out checking fences, and the woman was alone with the girls. At first she thought it might be him returning, but the rhythm of the hooves was wrong more than one rider, heavy and fast. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she pulled the girls close. "Stay quiet," she whispered, ushering them toward the corner by the hearth. The riders didn't stop at the door, but their voices carried faintly through the walls, harsh and unfamiliar. She couldn't make out the words, only the laughter, coarse and sharp. The girls clung to her, their eyes wide with fear. She held them tight, praying the men would move on. After what felt like forever, the sound of hooves faded into the distance. When the rancher returned later, she told him. His jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist. "They're circling closer," he muttered. "Won't be long before they test the fences, maybe more." His eyes moved to hers, sharp and searching. "If you're staying here, you need to be ready for what comes. My girl's safety comes first." The weight of his words pressed on her chest. It wasn't just about being a mother figure anymore. It was about standing firm when danger knocked at the door. And though fear clawed at her, she knew she could not run. The girls needed her. Deep inside, she needed them too. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. The rancher checked rifles, reinforced doors, and rode the land with a sharp eye. She stayed close to the girls, teaching them small ways to keep calm, hiding her own terror beneath a steady voice. The girls, in turn, clung tighter than ever, their trust in her now absolute. The tension reached its peak one evening when Bennett rode up again, his horse lathered, his face grave. "They hit my herd," he told the rancher. "He took 10 head in the night, bold as fire. If you're not ready, they'll come for yours next." The rancher's face hardened. Let them try. But inside, every soul in that house knew the storm was about to break. The woman lay awake that night. The girls nestled against her, the sound of the wind howling through the eaves. She thought of the rancher's question, of the life she'd stumbled into, of the fragile hope that had taken root here. She wanted to protect it, to protect them more than she'd ever wanted anything. Yet in the darkness another fear whispered, what if she failed? What if the rustlers came and the girls saw her weakness, and the rancher realized she was not the mother they needed? The fire burned low, shadows flickered across the walls, and every creak of the house made her heart jolt. The rancher stood watch by the door, rifle in hand, silent as stone. The air between them was thick with everything unsaid, and outside in the vast, merciless night, trouble was coming closer. Closer than any of them were ready for. The night of waiting felt endless. The woman sat close to the girls as the rancher stood by the door, rifle in hand, listening to every sound outside. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. She could hear the girls' breaths, shallow with fear, and the faint whistle of the wind through the shutters. Each creak of the floorboards made her heart jolt. She clutched the younger girl against her chest, whispering quiet words meant to calm her, though they were just as much for herself. The older girl's eyes stayed fixed on her father, watching him as though he were the only anchor holding the house together. Then came the sound they had been waiting for, the distant thud of hooves, slow but steady. The rancher stiffened, his hand tightening on the rifle. The woman's throat went dry. She wanted to look out, to see how many, but she dared not move. The horses drew nearer, circling the yard, and then silence fell. The kind of silence that only comes when danger is deciding its next move. The rancher motioned for her to keep the girls down. He eased the door open just a crack, eyes scanning the dark. For a moment, all she could hear was her own pulse, loud as a drum. Then a voice rang out from the shadows, rough and mocking. "We know you're in there, rancher. We've come for what's ours. Step aside, and maybe we'll leave the house standing." The rancher didn't flinch. "You've taken cattle that weren't yours. Come closer, and you'll pay more than you reckon." His voice was steady, low, like stone grinding against stone. The riders laughed, the sound harsh and mean. One fired a shot into the air, the crack splitting the night. The girls shrieked, and the woman pulled them close, shielding their faces. Her body shook, but her voice steadied as she whispered, "You're safe. I won't let go." She surprised herself with the certainty in those words. The standoff stretched, the night holding its breath. Then came the sound of galloping hooves, louder now, rushing. Shots rang out, one after another, echoing across the yard. The rancher fired back, his face unyielding, the rifle steady in his hands. The woman felt each shot in her bones, each one a reminder of how close danger pressed to their lives. At last the riders pulled back, retreating into the hills with curses flung into the dark. Silence fell again, broken only by the ragged breaths inside the house. The rancher lowered his rifle slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes still sharp with the weight of what had just passed. The woman realized she was trembling, but when she looked down, she saw the girls clinging to her, their trust absolute. The younger one whispered, "You didn't let go." The older girl, eyes wet with tears she fought to hide, said softly, "Mama would have done the same." Something inside her broke and healed in the same moment. She had feared she could never fill the emptiness these girls carried, that her rags and broken past made her unworthy. But in the hour of fear, she had given them what they needed most, her arms around them, her promise not to leave. And that was worth more than any riches. The rancher turned, his gaze falling on her. For a moment he said nothing, only studying her with the same measuring look he had given that first night. But it was different now. His eyes carried something deeper, something that softened the sharp edges of his face. "You stood firm," he said simply. "You gave them what I couldn't." The following days were spent mending what had been broken. Bennett and other neighbors came to help, bringing word that the rustlers had been chased far beyond the ridge. The danger was gone for now, yet the rancher knew, and so did she, that danger was always waiting in the distance on land like this. Life on the frontier was never free of it. But somehow, facing it together, had changed the shape of the fear. The girls no longer asked if she would stay forever, simply acted as if she already had. The younger girl placed her rag doll in the woman's hands and said, "She belongs to you now." The older one began bringing her schoolwork without hesitation, sitting beside her by the fire each evening. Their trust was quiet, steady, and more binding than any promise spoken aloud. One afternoon, as the snow began to melt and the land showed its first signs of spring, the rancher returned from the fields and found her hanging laundry on the line. The girls chased one another in the yard, laughter rising into the crisp air. For a long moment he watched the scene, the house no longer hollow, the land no longer weighed down by silence. He walked closer, stopping just behind her. "You've worked harder than anyone had a right to ask," he said. She turned, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, unsure of what answer he sought. He looked toward the girls, then back at her. "The night those men came, I saw what you gave them. Not just safety. You gave them a reason to believe they're not alone anymore. That's worth more than cattle, more than land." His voice softened, but carried the same gravity as before. "When I asked you if you'd be the mother my girls need, I wasn't asking for perfection. I was asking if you'd stay, through fear and through hardship, as steady as you were that night." Her eyes burned with tears she had held back for too long. She thought of the road that had led her here, the cold nights, the shame of begging, the way her past had stripped her bare. And yet here she stood, with two girls who had placed their hearts in her keeping, and a man who was offering her more than a place by the fire. He was offering her a life, one built on trust, work, and the simple truth of standing together. She nodded slowly, her voice steady, though her hands shook. "I'll stay. Not because I'm worthy, but because they need me, because I need them too. The rancher gave a slow nod, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That's all I was asking. The girls came running then, wrapping their arms around her waist, laughing as though the whole world had changed. And perhaps it had. For the first time in years, the woman felt the weight of belonging settle on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a blessing. The seasons turned as they always did. Snow melted, grass grew green, and calves filled the pastures. Work never ended, but the house was filled with warmth, with laughter, and with the kind of strength born only from hardship shared. The woman who had once begged for work in rags was no longer just a stranger. She had become the heart of the home, the steady hand the girls leaned on, and the partner the rancher had needed more than he had ever admitted. And though whispers in town still carried, they no longer mattered. For within the walls of that house and across the land that stretched beyond, there was a family that had chosen one another. Bound not by blood or riches, but by courage, trust, and the simple act of staying when it mattered most. In the end, her journey had not been about finding work or shelter. It had been about finding a place where her hands, her heart, and her scars could be turned into something greater. She had become what the rancher asked for, not out of duty, but out of love that had quietly taken root in the hardest season of her life. And as the sun set over the wide fields, casting golden light across the ranch, she knew with a certainty that this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a life she had thought she would never find. A life where she was no longer just surviving, she was home.